Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, where we will be talking about the Relative Proficiency Index. My name is Sarah Holman, and I am the Clinical Product Marketing Director here at Riverside Insights. And today I am joined by three members of our development team, Dr. Eric Snader, Gabriel Gentet, and Cindy Curry. I'm going to pass it over to Eric in just a minute to introduce the group. But before I do, I would like the audience members to know that this is an interactive discussion. So we would love it if you have questions for our panel. If you could put those into the question section on the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will be sure to ask our panel those questions as they come in. So I'm going to pass it over to Eric right now to introduce the group.
Great, Sarah, thank you. Just to check, you can hear me, correct?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, thank you for allowing my team this opportunity. Again, my name is Eric Snader. I work as the director of the clinical content development team here at Riverside Insights. And I have two people on my team, Cindy Curry and Gabriel Gentet. We've been working with these products for years now, some of us in the capacity of a school psychologist and some in the capacity of clinical development. So we have our hands in, just so people understand, we have our hands on the products from the blueprint development through developing the content, through working with the research team in helping to take the data that were analyzed and translating that into the final product. We also work with all the other teams like editorial, marketing, sales, et cetera. But today what we're going to do is focus on the Relative Proficiency Index metric.
Great. So I have some questions to get the discussion started. But again, feel free to put any questions that you may have for our panel into the question section on the control panel. So one of the unique features of the WJ suite of products is the RPI score. We've been talking about this quite a bit recently. We had a webinar on it not too far back, and really exploring its utility and explaining students' performance. Can you speak to how this score is derived and sort of the thought process behind its development?
Sure. So I have slides that I'm going to go through, and I'll answer that question and probably some other questions that people have. So Sarah, feel free to jump in and stop me if I've gone on too long or if you have other questions.
Sure.
So let me see if this works. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is talk a little bit about the Rasch measurement model. And I'm thinking, I suspect that most, or some, at least some people on this call have familiarity with the Rasch model. It's basically the measurement model that's used to build the Woodcock-Johnson tests. It's the underlying model. It's elegant yet simple, and it is the model that makes everything else we're going to talk about today possible. And the cool thing about the Rasch model is that you really don't have to understand the mathematics behind the model to understand how to use the scores. So we're not going to talk about the really specific psychometrics. We're going to talk about how the RPI is derived and based on this model. So when we use the Rasch model to develop a test, we create a test scale that resembles a ruler, and that's what you're seeing on the screen right now. Just as we can use a ruler to measure the size of an object, like a table or a book, we can use the Rasch ruler to measure a latent trait or ability. And when I say that, what I mean is like math calculations or reading comprehension or long-term memory. You're probably used to seeing an ordinary ruler that shows inches from 1 to 12 or centimeters or millimeters, plus all of the smaller increments. So half inches, quarter inches, 1/16, etc. So those little marks on the side of the ruler are equally spaced, and that's really important here. So that the distance from one end of the ruler to the 1 inch mark, for example, so 0 to 1, that's the same distance as if you go from the 6 inch mark to the 7 inch mark. That's what we mean when we say that they're equally spaced. So anywhere you go on the ruler, an inch is an inch, and we can say that the inch scale is equal interval. So when we think about this imaginary Rasch ruler that we see on the screen, the same principle applies. But instead of numbers from 1 to 12, our Rasch ruler has numbers that you see are in the 400s, the 500s, the 600s. And instead of calling them inches or centimeters, what we call these numbers are W points. But just like the inches ruler, the Rasch W points are also equally spaced. And because most people are not used to using a ruler that has numbers in the 400s, 500s, 600s, etc., let me just see if this works. Here we go. We use a common frame of reference across all of the tests in the entire Woodcock-Johnson battery. So cognitive, achievement, or language, where we have 500 is the anchor point, and that's what represents the ability of a typical 10-year-old. And this gives us a very general idea of whether a score for a given individual is high or low. So again, the WJ tests are anchored on the score, a W score of 500. If anyone out there uses the Battelle Developmental Inventory, that test, the third version, the third edition, is also based on the Rasch measurement model. But instead of 500 being a typical 10-year-old, 500 is a typical 3-year-old. And that's just because of the utility for the BDI being birth through age 7. When we use an inches ruler, we're measuring something that has physical size, right? We can see it. But when we measure abilities with a Rasch ruler, we need some way to assign meaning to all of these tick marks. And for that, we use test items to assign meaning to our scale. So for example, we place the test items along the W scale so that easy items are towards the bottom or left side of this ruler, and the hard items are towards the top or the right side. And when I say top and bottom, it's based on the number, the W score. So 530 obviously is greater than 500. Because our Rasch scale is equal interval, the distance between the items is relative. So in this example, if we look at item 3 is just a little bit harder than item 2, right? Because item 2 has a W score of 483. Item 3 has a W score of 490. That's the item difficulty. But item 6, item's W score of 527, is quite a bit harder than item 5, right? You see the distance is greater. So here's where the magic, here's the magic that makes everything else possible. When we give someone a test that has been constructed on the Rasch model, we can put the people, you'll see here, on the same ruler as the test items. So on the top, you see the difficulty score for the items. On the bottom, what you're seeing are the ability scores of the people who took the test. So the people can be assigned these locations on the ruler in order of ability. People whose scores are towards the left or have lower W scores are said to have less ability than people whose scores are at the right end of the scale. So in this example, we see that Bonnie is just a little bit more able than Anna, because there's a difference of 8 W points. But Diane is quite a bit more able than Chris, because in that there's a difference of 19 W points. So by putting people and items on the same ruler, we can compare people's ability on the bottom here to the item's difficulty. And the distance between an item and a person on the ruler tells us how easy or difficult the item will be for that person. So when an item is exactly at the same point on the ruler as a person, and we see that with item 3 and Bonnie, what we can say is we know that that person, Bonnie, will be 50% likely to get that item correct. When an item is higher on the ruler than a person, the item will be more difficult for that person. And conversely speaking, when an item is lower on the ruler, that item will be easier for the person. So in this example, item 1 will be pretty easy for Anna. Item 1 will be very easy for Diane. Conversely, item 5 will be pretty difficult for Bonnie. The further away an item and a person are from each other on this theoretical ruler, the more certain we can be of that the outcome when that person takes the item or the test. So when we talk about how many W points there are difference between the item and the examinee's score, we can use this table rather. So here are some easy to interpret probabilities for how an examinee will perform on an item, given the item's distance from the examinee's ability, which is what we just saw on the ruler. So you can see that when an examinee's ability on the ruler is much higher than the item's difficulty, that's towards the top here, the examinee will almost certainly get that item correct. So for example, if the examinee's ability is 50 points higher than the item difficulty, we can predict that that examinee will be 99% successful. There's a 99% chance they'll be successful on that item. And then conversely, on the other hand, when the examinee's ability is much lower on the ruler than the item's difficulty, the examinee will almost certainly get the item wrong. So if we look at an item that's where the examinee ability is 20 points lower than the item difficulty, we can say that there's a 10% chance that examinee will get that item correct. And again, when the item and the examinee are matched up perfectly, we expect the success rate to be 50%. There's a 50% chance they'll get that item correct. Okay, so here's an example of an item. We say item 2, and it's got this theoretical or hypothetical W score, difficulty score of 483. And then our examinee, Chris, has an ability score, W score of 503. So Chris's ability is 20 points higher than the item's difficulty. So if we were more interactive, I would ask, what is the percent probability of success for Chris on item 2? Let me, you can do this on your own. There's the examinee's ability is 20 points higher than the item difficulty. What can we say about the examinee's chance of succeeding or getting that item correct? We would say there's a 90% chance. So Chris is pretty likely to get that question correct for that item. So again, Chris will be 90% likely. So that's item 2 is an easy item for Chris on this test. In this example, Chris's ability is 10 W points lower than the item's difficulty for item 5. So there's less of a chance they'll get that correct. Let's figure out what that probability is. So Chris's ability is 10 points lower than the item difficulty. That means there's a 25% chance that Chris will get that item correct. So item 5 is pretty difficult for Chris. So what I'm going to focus now is we're looking at this difference. We're going to get into the real answer to the question you asked, Sarah, in just a little bit. So in the same way that we can locate items on the W scale, and that's what we were looking at, item 1, item 2, we can also locate groups of people on that same scale. And this is where the RPI comes into play. So when we norm the test, typically we give the test to thousands of people. We're talking 6,000, 7,000 people across the entire age range. And for WJ, I believe it starts at 2 to age 90 plus. Then what we do is we summarize the performance of the people at each age using what we're calling the median W score. I'm going to give that a name or a term in just a little bit. But when we locate those median W scores on our ruler, we begin to see an expected pattern of growth across the age range for this given test. So remember that our scale is equal intervals. So the distances between the median scores at each age are meaningful. So for example, on this test, a lot of growth occurs between ages 6 and 8. So there's a lot of growth because we can see the distance in W points is pretty large. Same thing with 8 to 10 years old. But when we get to age 12 to 14, there's not as much change or growth on this hypothetical test. So this could be, maybe it's letter recognition, word reading, where there's a lot of growth from kindergarten through grades 3, let's say. And then as we get to middle school, the growth curve kind of plateaus or isn't as sharp. So what do we call these median scores, these median W scores? We call them reference Ws. And the reference W is, again, the median score for a given age or grade. So in the same way that the distance we talked about between people and items have meaning, the distances between people and the reference W's also have meaning. And what we do is we say that by comparing an examinee's score to the reference W on that for that age or grade, we can see how likely the examinee is to be successful. Now we're saying with tasks, not just the item, but with tasks that the typical or average peer would find manageable. So we call the distance between an examinee and their reference W, what do we call it? We call that the W difference score. Okay, so that's the W difference. That is the key for computing the RPI that we're going to get into now. Okay, so now here is where we get to the meat of that question you just asked, Sarah. The Relative Proficiency Index, or RPI, and I sidebar here, when I worked as a school psychologist and I worked for 14 years, I had no idea what the RPI was or how to use it. It's also used in the scales of independent behavior, the CIB-R, but I kind of glossed over it. It wasn't until I got the job at Riverside that I truly understood it. And then it was too late for me to actually use it. And I'm really quite upset that I wasn't able to use it because it's such a really helpful score that we're going to get into. So this score is really just a way of describing the W difference, right, between the reference W and the person's ability. It says, this could be the statement, how likely is my examinee to be successful with tasks, we're describing the test, that his or her peers can do with 90% success. So the RPI is expressed as a ratio, with the number on the bottom always being 90. It represents the set of test-related tasks that typical peers can complete with 90% success. So some of you may ask, like, why is it set at 90%? That's typically the level at which we consider success, 90%. 100 would be way too high and unrealistic. And just a little trivia fact here, what does the W mean? My group was lucky enough to meet with Dr. Woodcock a few months ago for a question and answer, and it's as simple as W stands for Woodcock. That's the answer. So the number on the bottom is what the typical group would experience, where the typical group would experience 90% success. The top number describes the examinee's likelihood of success on those same tasks. So the top number, the numerator, is the examinee's likelihood of success, and the bottom number is the reference W, where the typical grade or age peers would complete with 90% success. Same task, remember. So here's a handy chart. This is in your the technical manual of the WJ, and it shows that for any W difference going from greater than 28-point difference to negative 68-point difference, the associated RPI score. So notice that when the examinee's, and this is important, when the examinee's W ability is higher than their typical peers, or when the W difference is positive, that means the examinee has a greater than 90% likelihood of success on these age or grade appropriate tasks. And we're going to get into specific examples, but that's the left side of this table when we go from a W difference or W diff score of 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, etc. The RPI, the numerator in the RPI, is going to be higher, meaning the examinee is going to have a higher rate of success than their age or grade mates. And the converse is true too. When the examinee's W ability is lower than their typical peers, meaning that the W difference is negative, the examinee has a lower than 90% likelihood of success on age or grade appropriate tasks. So this chart's really helpful. Okay, so let's see here. So when Chris's ability on the bottom here, his or her, their W score, ability score is 503, is compared to the median W score, the reference W for ages 12, that's 513. Well, we can say that there's a difference of 10 points, right? The W diff, or the W difference, is negative 10 because Chris's ability is lower than the reference W for 12-year-olds. So we can say that the RPI score is 75 over 90. Let's just go back here. And we can see, if we locate -10 on this table, we can see the RPI derivation or translation is 75 over 90. And then, so that's how it's derived. Sarah, I can go into, let me just do a few more slides and then I'll turn it back to you, because this will probably get into some questions that people might have. So perhaps the most useful, the W difference and the RPI ranges can also describe how difficult the examinee will find these age or grade related tasks. Could be short-term, long-term memory, reading comprehension, etc. So in our Chris example, his W difference or W diff score was -10 because his ability was 10 points lower than the reference W for 12-year-olds. His RPI was 75 over 90, and we'll get into how we can express that in an IEP. So we see from this table that Chris will find age level tasks difficult, right? Because we find the W diff score, which is -10, and that translates into a 75 over 90, so it is in this range. We can say their proficiency level is limited to average, and the examinee, Chris, will find age or grade level tasks to be difficult. Let me just do a few more. One more, actually. So now that we have two new ways to talk about Chris's ability, we can use the RPI, and if we only use the RPI, we can say in a statement in the PLAF page, let's say, Chris will be 75% successful with tasks his peers can complete with 90% success. Or we can just say, we can use the proficiency description and say that age level tasks will be difficult for Chris. So Sarah, I'll turn it back to you. Did that answer the question on how we derive the RPI?
Yes, there were a couple questions that came in regarding the W score and a request to sort of repeat how the W score is calculated for an individual. It's not something that the examiners enter or it's automatically calculated, but how is that calculated?
Correct. Okay, so I will admit that that is out of my wheelhouse because that's more in the research realm and the psychometricians do that. But I will say it's what happens is when we gather all of the normative data, norms tables are constructed, and that's where we have these lookup tables that are all part of our online scoring platform. So what will happen behind the scenes is that as the examiner, you will plug in the raw score for, let's say, oral vocabulary reading and oral vocabulary synonyms and antonyms. So you'll plug in the raw score, and behind the scenes, the platform, we have the algorithms that convert the raw score to a W score. Now, how that's done is very detailed. It's based on logits, and I can't get into that because I don't fully understand it, but there's a way to convert the raw score with the logit being like 9.0 something, and it is converted into a W score. Much like if some of the people on the call are familiar, and I test still do this, where you have the lookup tables in a manual. You see in the table, you find the person's age, you look for the raw score, and then you see that standard score conversion. You don't actually know necessarily how it's done. You just know that a raw score of X becomes a standard score of Y. That's the same thing with the W scores.
Okay, and then someone is asking for clarification. Is the W score related to is the W scale related to W scores or growth scores?
Okay, so that's a great question. And if you use the BDI, we call them change sensitive scores. It's all on the same ruler. So what the question gets to is, I think, progress monitoring and how do we measure and chart growth. So because the Rasch ruler, this theoretical ruler, is based on an equal interval model, we look at Chris's performance, their W score now. Let's just say we tested that person today. It's 503. If we test Chris again in 3 months, giving the same test, let's say oral vocabulary, and Chris's W score is 515, that's the growth score. We can say that 515 minus 503, that's a 12-point difference. That is meaningful. That's a growth score. And then we can look at the RPI translation and say how successful Chris can be. So these are the growth scores that can be used that way to chart growth.
Okay. We have a question. Was that Chris has a 75% chance of being successful, or Chris is likely to be successful on 75% of items?
That's a great question. So not necessarily 75% of the, well, that's a great question. I may need to get back to you on that, but because when we say 75% successful, when we're talking about norm reference tests, it's not necessarily a 70, like 7 out of 10 or 7.5 items out of 10. It's not necessarily the same. So I may have to get back to you on that one. If Gabriel and Cindy can write that down, just so I remember.
Okay, well explained, thank you. Okay, so now we have some questions coming in regarding RPI and standard score. So that sort of leads us into our next discussion topic. So a couple of the questions, just to sort of set some context for this discussion, is the RPI more useful than the standard score? And how can people explain or potentially use for eligibility the RPI when a student may have an average standard scores, but an RPI proficiency level that is limited?
Okay, perfect. Okay, so the slide deck I have that I've used with a coworker, Erica Lafort, we've used this in the past for NASP. So, and it confirms that the questions people have are consistent. In that the next section here is the W difference based scores do not always tell the same story as the norm reference scores. So let me go into that now. The RPI, I'm going to have Gabriel address this in just a little bit, but the RPI and the standard score, they're different, and they're not always aligned in that if a standard score is average, that does not mean that the RPI is going to be 90 or above necessarily. So let's talk about what the differences are in those scores. So when we talk about a measure of proficiency, which is the RPI, that's a criterion referenced score. The standard score is norm referenced. So the RPI offers criterion referenced information, which really describes the quality of the performance. So again, Chris will be show or display 75% success, whereas his age mates or grade mates would be showing 90%. Success. We can also monitor progress. I just talked about that, how it's an equal interval scale, and we can look at the ability W scores over time. Whereas with standard scores, we'll get into this, you cannot chart progress. It just tells you ranking, right? And then the last thing here, the RPI indicates the range of development or instruction. And we have tables in the manual that I'll show you that can help with that. So again, the RPI provides a criterion referenced index of the person's proficiency. What is their ability? And we compare that to the proficiency of the age or grade mates. That's the reference W. And again, it's the RPI is based on the W difference between the reference W and the person's ability, or W. So what about, how is that different from the standard scores? So the standard scores and percentile ranks, what they do is they compare students and give their relative standing among age or grade peers. So maybe your statement in the reports is, so-and-so achieved a standard score of 90, which puts their performance in the average range compared to other people their age. They perform better than 50% of kids their age. It's just ranking. What the standard score and percentile rank do not do is give us specific information on how to drive instruction or speak about proficiency. That's the RPI. So I'm going to go back to Before we get to why, or are there instances where there's a difference between standard scores and RPIs, let's go back to this. And Gabriel, I'm going to ask you to jump in if you don't mind. Does the RPI add any information that the standard score doesn't, or when there's an average standard score but lower ability? So I'll have you address that.
Absolutely. So typically with evaluators working in schools, you might come across a situation to where you're explaining test results to a parent or teacher, and you might say, for example, Joni's reading comprehension is in the average range, and the parents and teachers are basically telling you that they don't agree with that, or it doesn't make sense, or Corey hasn't responded to the intensive interventions in math. How could he perform in the average range on your tests? So when that happens, the RPI does give you a little bit more information. So when you look at your standard scores, which are used to make eligibility determinations, if they are close to or within the average range in the areas that the student is reported to have difficulty in, take a look at those RPI scores, because they can provide you with important information to help explain that inconsistency. And if the standard scores and the RPI scores are consistent, you have data to show that the student's skills in that academic area are currently stable and that their instruction is appropriate. So both scores are valuable and necessary to gather the full picture of the student, but the RPI score might help you build a case for eligibility if you're finding your previously gathered data to be inconsistent with your standard score. You obviously want to make sure that you're following the policy and procedures set forth by your school district, but evaluators, their job is to kind of build the case and consider all available data and leave no stone unturned to make sure that you're supporting the student to get any services that they're legally entitled to.
Perfect, great, thank you. So to add to that, there are instances, or there will be instances, where the standard score is, let's say, in the average range, but the RPI is much lower. And that has to do with the specific test, what we're measuring, the growth curves, the age of the examinee. So let's just say it's reading. There's a lot more growth in reading at the younger ages. The standard deviation might be larger. All of that is taken into consideration when the raw score is converted to a W score. And then once we have the Rasch scores, those scores then can be converted into scores such as the standard score, percentile rank, et cetera. And as Gabriel said, it's really important in meetings to provide both, because if you give a standard score and you totally lose the trust of the parents and teachers, you gain them back when you say, but when I look at the RPI, which measures proficiency, what I'm seeing is what you're telling me. So there's a lot of consistency there.
Okay. Do you have any examples, or can you provide how this might be sort of written up in a psychoeducational report? And should you report, if there's a difference between the RPI and the standard score, should you report both or just the RPI?
Good question. Let me just jump ahead here, because I think I have, whoops, hold on. Okay, here we go. So let me just, before I answer that question completely, I just want to show this visual that one of our former coworkers created, and I really like this example. So the standard score or scaled scores, percentile ranks versus the relative proficiency index. So here what we're seeing, this is a representation of a standard score or ranking. So we see that the horse is in the first percentile, so the horse is not doing really well, but the cat appears in the 99th percentile. So For those of you who have run races, this might make more sense, but I'll explain it so that it does. So the relative standing can remain the same, but your performance could be very different. So, for example, if I'm running a race and I'm running against or with a lot of people who are really fast, I could be the horse here and come in the first percentile, meaning that I report out that my standard score is really, really low, percentile rank of 1. But that doesn't tell you how well I ran, right? I could have run my fastest race ever. And then the opposite is true. If I am in a race where we have a lot of walkers, I could come in the 99th percentile. So my ranking is really good, but I ran the worst time of my life. So again, ranking tells us where we stand amongst our peers, whereas the relative proficiency index tells us how well did we do or how poorly did we do. So that's the first. And then Sarah, remind me how we can write this up. So let's get to this. So let's say on a test, an examinee gets a W score that's translated to a W diff score or W difference, and then the RPI translation is 52/90. So how can we write that up in an IEP? Because that's going to be important. This directly, in my eyes, directly relates to the present levels page. We could say when average grade or age students have 90% success on, let's say, reading or letter recognition, this student, Chris, has 52% success. So I think that kind of makes it more real. We could also use this instructional level, and remember that these are all in the technical manual. So we can say that this RPI was, for Chris, I think was 75. So we can say that in reading, Chris is at the instructional level. And a lot of teachers understand this because it's based on the leveled readers that teachers use. So if you remember nothing else about the RPIs, remember that remember this table, that the RPI not only tells us about proficiency, but it can allow us to explain it in IEPs, in our reports. So to make it even more concrete, let's look at some statements here. So here we go. I'll just read them. I know you can read them to yourself, but I'll read it out loud. Julie's RPI of 5/90 on spelling indicates she will be frustrated. How do we know that? Because 5/90 is in the frustration level. So she will be frustrated compared to average grade mates. We can also say that on testing, Julie's spelling indicates that she was or will show 5% success, while her grade mates show 90% success. So that kind of makes it real. Here is someone in the middle here. So Nico is likely to have 90% success on similar math calculation tasks, when his peers will also show 90% success. And then if it's here, Karen will find decoding tasks easy. How do we know that? Because her RPI is above 90, and we can report that if we want. So she will find decoding tasks easy at a beginning 3rd grade level, but difficult at mid 4th grade level. How do we know that? Because we're looking at the reference W's, the reference W scores for 3rd grade and 4th grade, and where does her ability score lie? So that hopefully answers your question. Those are some statements you can use.
Yeah, I think the visual of the race is very helpful in understanding why there can be such a difference between the RPI and the standard score. So it's fair to say that the RPI is criterion reference because it reflects the difficulty of the task as well?
Correct. We're looking, yes, we're looking at the difficulty on the top of the ruler, the item difficulty, the task difficulty, and at the bottom, we're looking at person ability. Correct. And you know what, I forgot to click the animation here. So what we're seeing here is an illustration of the ranking, how it doesn't change, but the performance changes, right? They're all kind of clustered with the horse a little bit behind, but look what happens here. The cat is way faster, but is still at the same percentile rank. The goat, if that's what it is a lot slower than this dog, but the relative ranking or standing stays the same.
Okay. There is a question that you might not have the answer to because it has to do with sort of local eligibility criteria or state level eligibility criteria. But
Okay.
there is a question about when a student scores in the average range on a standard score or earns an average standard score, but their performance on RPI shows otherwise, how do we use it towards eligibility in a district who uses the discrepancy model?
So the discrepancy would be between I know how I used to use it, but discrepancy between what and what?
I would say a standard score on a cognitive assessment and a standard score on achievement assessment. That's what I would assume.
Sure. So I think what Gabriel said is very important, that and we get questions like this a lot from customers, which I appreciate. As a publishing company, we don't set criteria for eligibility. What we should be consistently saying is it's really up to how your school district sets it, your organization, your state level of Department of Education. It's really up to them. But as a user of WJ and your understanding of the RPI, you can go back and make an argument that we can look at the W scores and the RPIs and somehow create a model on which you can look at the discrepancy. Because when you look at performance, if we compare, let's say, cognitive to achievement, when we look at, let's say reading, the cognitive correlates to reading, what are the RPIs, what are the W scores for those? Compare that to the achievement W scores and RPIs, we can see differences, or we may see differences. But as far as how do we determine the criteria for eligibility, that's going to be up to your organization.
Okay. And the reference W's can be found in the technical manual?
Correct. I have the digital version on my computer, but I'm afraid while I share my screen, I would have my email open too much. But I can't remember if maybe, I don't know if Cindy or Gabriel has it open. We have those. We have examples of, but all of the tables, those conversion tables, those are built into the online platform. So we don't have the lookup tables, which is what I think that question is referring to.
Okay.
We'll just have examples of.
Okay. Is there a way to interpret the magnitude of growth scores? In other words, how do we know when growth is meaningful?
That's a great question. Gabriel or Cindy, do you have any answers for that while I find a slide that might help? And the answer might be no.
Well, as far as measuring growth, if you wanted to gather additional achievement testing using a different test form, there's A, B, and C, you would be able to retest that student over maybe 2 or 3 times a year. And then you would have the actual data to show if there was an increase in their RPI scores, which could also demonstrate that the interventions they're receiving have been effective.
Exactly. Yeah, perfect. And also remember what we talked about earlier is that because and you can see on the screen, because the Rasch ruler is equal interval, it's just intuitive that a change from 500 to a score of 505 on retest is not as great as if you went from 500 to 515. So it's almost like if you measure your height, you go to the doctor and today you're 5'5", and next time 6 months later you're 5'6". 6 months after that you're 5'11". I mean, there's been a lot of growth from appointment 2 to appointment 3. So you just have to kind of gauge it that way.
Okay. Last one before we talk a little bit about how the RPI can help guide IEP teams. Is it fair to say that the RPI is often more aligned to functional data rather than the standard score as it speaks to student performance?
I would say yes. And that really speaks to the difference between norm referenced scores, where it talks about standing or ranking only, versus the RPI, which does talk about performance and ability. So yes, I mean, they're very different. And there should be a paper, a journal article coming out in the next, let's say, year, and I can't give details about it, but the overarching theme is why standard scores are not useful and why criterion reference scores such as the RPI are useful when we're talking about a person's ability. So as soon as we get more information on that article within Riverside, then we can communicate that out to customers.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how the RPI can help. You alluded to the instructional levels, but how can it help IEP teams in the development of appropriate goals and objectives?
Okay. Gabriel, do you feel comfortable fielding that question or no?
Sure, I can get us started.
Okay.
So as far as that, as we've discussed, when considering multiple sources of data, the RPI scores provide helpful information. And what that can do is contribute to a narrower focus that can help specify the intensity of recommended interventions. For example, if the student meets eligibility criteria for learning disability in math calculation, you can look at the RPI scores for the calculation and math facts fluency subtests, and that can help pinpoint which of the two areas is in greater need of intervention. So the RPI scores also have the instructional implications, which range from, nearly impossible to extremely easy as far as how the student may perform on those tasks. So basically, it adds a bit more meaningful information that makes more sense to parents and teachers as far as creating any goals that the standard scores just don't provide with their classifications of average or low average.
So as IEP teams are developing these goals and objectives and wanting to monitor students' progress on these goals and objectives, if you have administered the test and a student earned a certain, say, W score, and then the second administration they earned a second W score, what difference between those W scores would you say would reflect adequate progress or good growth toward that skill?
That's a great question. For that, I would probably use the RPI score. And what would you set that criteria at as far as being successful on that goal? That's completely up to you. So if at the first testing in reading comprehension, let's say, the RPI score is a 25 over 90, so that child will be successful 25% of the time, while their grade mates will be successful 90% of the time. Depending on that individual child, and hopefully we know that child pretty well, we might say if they're 25% successful now, by the next grading period, maybe we'll set that criteria of success for that objective to be at 30 or 35%. So their RPI we're shooting for is 30 or 35 over 90. But again, so where you set that and what's meaningful is really based on the child. So if the child starts off at a really low level, they might not make as much progress given their cognitive functioning, or they might make a lot of progress given the intervention. So it's really up to the IEP team to figure out what do you think the child is able to do, and then set that numerator, that proficiency level at that whatever level you think is realistic. So I don't know if that answers your question in a concrete way, but the takeaways are it's up to the IEP team to set that level. also, are you looking at next grading period versus end of the year? So if it's end of the year, you'll want to set it higher. So maybe like if it's starting off as a 25 over 90, maybe 40 over 90. And you might say, well, 40 over 90 is not great, but that's the child's progress relative to their performance upon first testing. How much closer are they getting to age or grade mates?
We had a couple of questions about proficiency index measures. Is the WJ or the WJ suite of products the only ones that include a proficiency index measure, or do other sort of common tests out there also include something similar?
Okay, great question, and that's a great plug for our products. So I believe the first test on, so first of all, Dr. Woodcock is credited as creating this whole RPI, and that's one of his greatest legacies, and he still is alive, by the way. I believe the first test that he built on this Rasch model, I believe is key math. Which I believe is still being used. All of our tests in the Woodcock-Johnson suite, so we're talking cognitive, achievement, oral language, Woodcock-Munoz, Bateria, those are all built on the Rasch model. The scales of independent behavior, which is an older test, it's a rating scale, that's also built on the Rasch model. The Battelle developmental inventory, as I said, is also more recently with a third edition built on the Rasch model. As far as other publishers, I don't know the exact answer, but I think that the answer is no. I think that we are the only publisher to build our tests on the Rasch model, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But what I would suggest is go to the other manuals and look beyond the standard scores and percentile ranks. See what other score, if any, they provide.
We have an observation here that I'd like to get your thoughts on. It says, it seems that the RPI is meaningful for describing certain skills, for example, reading comprehension, but less meaningful for the GIA.
Okay, that's a great question. So Cindy, Gabriel, and I had the opportunity at NASP a few weeks ago, I guess it was at this point, to be privy to a panel led by the WJ authors, and Dr. Woodcock was in the audience, and all that to say that the GIA is like this. We all know it's this overall like theoretical cognitive score. And we know for the WJ, the GIA is based on 7 tests that are not equally weighted, right? There's a differential weighting of the 7 scores that roll up to the GIA. So with all that said, the GIA is the score we use most, right? But the actual, like the GF score, the GC, the processing speed, et cetera, are probably more meaningful because they're more specific to an area of assessment, right? Long-term memory, short-term memory, crystallized knowledge, et cetera. So the GIA, I would probably agree with that's probably not as meaningful, because really, how would you report that out? That their overall, the general intellectual ability, what is that? Then you'd have to talk about there's at least 7 different areas.
Okay, we do have a question about how the grade levels get identified. I'm assuming that is referring to grade equivalency scores from the score report. Is there grade level data tied to Common Core grade level standards?
Oh, these are really great questions. So I have to say that one of my biggest misconceptions when I was first starting out as a school psychologist was what those grade equivalents and age equivalents actually mean. And I can't tell you how many times I read in reports or heard people say, oh, your child's grade equivalent is, let's say they're in 3rd grade. The grade equivalent is 5th grade. They're functioning at a 5th grade level. No, that's not what it means. So the grade equivalent and age equivalent, we have those scores on riversidescore.com. You can have those scores included. But the basic description of an age equivalent and a grade equivalent is that the person's score corresponds to the average score for people at a given grade or at a given age. It does not mean that your child can master a third grade curriculum. It just means that their score is the same as the average score for third graders. So is it aligned to core curriculum? No, not directly. We have crosswalks that I believe we've developed, but they're not, it's not a linear third grade age equivalent is equivalent to the Common Core. That's not the case.
Okay. I think this will be our last one for today. It's regarding the sensitivity of RPI numbers to change. I think in the context of maybe determining growth.
Okay. I'm not sure what the question is.
Yeah, I think they're asking, you know, how much growth is required to get that RPI score to sort of move up that 5 or 10 points.
So that's another great question that I don't have the answer to, because I believe it really depends on the skill that we're assessing. So if we go back to that slide where we saw that there was a great difference between, I think, 6-year-olds and 8-year-olds, because there was a lot of growth, it might not take a lot, it might not take a large raw score difference to have the RPI go up rather quickly. Whereas if there's not a lot of growth, it might take more raw score point differences to have a bigger RPI score. Does that answer the question? Really depends on the skill.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, well, we are just about at time, and I wanted to let everyone know that I will pass the questions along to the panel. If they have any sort of additional thoughts, we can get that information to you. I want to thank our panel for a great discussion today, really interesting information about the RPI. And to all of our participants, thank you for joining us today. And we hope to see you soon on another webinar. Have a great day.